today we have two amazing guests with us, so I'm just going to introduce them now. We have Jacqueline Novogratz, and Jacqueline is the founder and CEO of Acumen. It's an impact investing organization that's invested in, I think, over 150 companies around the world that are increasing access to clean energy, agriculture, healthcare, and education. And I know they've had a tremendous impact, reaching more than 400 million lives across South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the United States. And Jacqueline's also written a couple of books, and her most recent one is around a moral revolution that we need. And she talks about moral leadership, which is a topic we'll get to hear directly from her today. And then today in conversation with Jacqueline, we have Kassaga. Kassaga was an Acumen Fellow, I think in 2014, where he did work in India. But Kassaga now leads Teach for Uganda. And Teach for Uganda is another incredible organization that's all about nurturing leadership. In this case, to ensure that there's equitable access to quality education and opportunities for all children in Uganda. So it's going to be a great conversation. I think we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Kassaga, for about 20 to 25 minutes of conversation. And then after that, we'll do what we always do, which is open it up to the group for questions. So if there's something that sparks your curiosity, put it in the chat. So that we can get right into all the great questions as soon as the conversation wraps up. With that, over to you, Kassaga, to get us started.
Thank you, Radha, and thanks everyone for being here. Welcome. I'm so excited to be here in conversation with Jacqueline because she's been a mentor and really a role model for me. And part of what we do, the kind of leadership we develop at Teach for Uganda is really informed by a lot of Acumen values. So let's jump right in. Jacqueline, what a joy to be talking to you and sharing your story. So why don't you start by telling us your story? How did you come to believe in the importance of investing in leadership and building Acumen? Please share with us, Jacqueline.
Thanks, Kassaga. And it's just wonderful to be here. I so believe in what Wendy and all of you are doing with people first, that this is, change comes down to leadership, and that's part of what we'll be talking about today, and just love being here. I'm also here with my colleague who is one of the key leaders of Acumen Academy, Bavindra Mohan, so I hope that we get to pull him in to conversation as well. He was also a fellow like Kassaga at the global level. So I think I'm going to focus a little bit more on the leadership side of the work that we do, if that's okay, maybe with questions. If people want to talk more about the investing side, we can. But in a way, Kassaga, my whole journey on leadership started with my mentor, John Gardner, who did write the book on leadership called On Leadership. And he was a real bridge builder, a sort of patrician Republican, the only Republican on President Johnson's Democratic cabinet, who interestingly ran health, education, and welfare. So he was really at the forefront of many of the civil rights policies and would tell me stories about being in the room with Martin Luther King Jr. and knowing when to get out of the room. And John believed in all things leadership. One of the things he did was start the White House Fellows, and really imprinted me that if you wanted change, you needed to start with understanding the who and helping to build leadership. He didn't believe leaders were born. And then I would say in the 90s then, when John was still alive, I had this opportunity after a terrible event in Los Angeles created these riots, for those old enough to remember Rodney King beating, which was one of those momentous times of showing the fault lines in the United States. And so created a deliberately diverse core of American leaders with a real focus on trying to transcend the identity culture wars of the 1990s and really build a core of individuals across race, class, ethnicity, gender, ideology. And that really challenged me like almost nothing else had challenged me. I don't think I quite knew what I was getting myself into, but reinforced how important leadership was. Connected to that, though, was individual agency. How do you enable every human being to have more agency in their lives, which is so connected to leadership? So when we started Acumen, which was really focused on the agency part, using investment as a means of solving problems where both government and aid had failed, so that low-income people could have choice, opportunity around how they solve their own problems, it quickly became clear to us that while we focused on the leadership of the entrepreneur, she couldn't do it by herself. She needed to build in a leadership team around her that had the skills that inevitably the entrepreneur does not have. And so about 6 years into Acumen, we started the Global Fellows Program, and that's where both Kassaga and the Vidra came into the picture, identifying extraordinary leaders across the whole world, who were typically more elite, but had the skills, the tools, what we called the moral imagination, which we can get into on what do we need to teach, and we would literally throw them into our companies, whether it was a rice husk gasification company in rural Bihar, and just say, go, make yourself useful, help build a management team. And some didn't succeed very well, and some transformed the companies with the entrepreneurs. At the core of it, though, was this recognition that there's only so much you can do in a year, but the people doing that work will have such a different experience that will then allow them to do more, as our hope was, the architects of social change. And when I look across the sector today, many of those global fellows like these two are doing just that. About 5 years into that program, however, our regional advisors, because Acumen has, like Teach for All, regional footprints with local leadership, they said it's not enough. You're sending us 4 amazing individuals for a country like Pakistan that has 200 million people in it. We want our own leadership program. And so we agreed, provided that the fellowship programs were deliberately diverse across the same lines of difference. And now we're 1,000 fellows across the world that are starting to ask ourselves the questions with Acumen Academy. How then do you take that training, those skills, that language, those rituals, and share them with anyone, anywhere? Because this is a moment of awakening in the world where we need to change our systems, and we can't do it by ourselves. How do you release the energies of other people based on what we've learned? And that's where we are today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I mean, I could share a bit of my own story and how I came to Acumen, because my excitement was about actually those ideals that Acumen borrows from the letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King, the ideals of that moral imagination, the creative tension, because some of us were coming from those places where iniquity we had suffered iniquity, we had gone through those challenges, but then we realized that leaning in, I loved how Acumen would say, leaning into discomfort and really having tough conversations, which Jacqueline would emphasize, but at the same time with respecting each other and having that sense of urgency. And part of also what excited me was this idea of investing in people, and also how do you enable others to have that kind of dignity? For me, was my excitement, and I could share a long story of my journey in India, and also the idea that as a fellow, you are able to fail, and while you fail, you are actually learning. I love that patience. Acumen, I think the patience was also not only in the capital, but also in the leaders to learn to fail. But when you fail, you walk away with the lessons. And some of those are what I use at Teach for Uganda today. So thank you, Jacqueline. Maybe you could share a little bit more about, throughout this journey, what have been your biggest learnings about what type of leadership we need in today's world? Because things have changed. So I'm sure you have some lessons for us.
Thanks, Kassaga. Thanks for what you just said too. And I think this I wasn't, when you asked that question, I'm not going to talk specifically about failure, but you remind me, and I saw Oladapo shake his head when you talked about failure, that I think we underestimated when we started how so many cultures around the world make it really hard for individuals to talk about, think about, or even risk to have failure. And that's been a big piece of one of the unexpected pieces of what we're working have to do. But to answer your specific question, Kassaga, how the world is different, and certainly looking around at you all, some of you are my generation and some of you are Vidra and Kassaga's generation. My generation, we grew up with a framework that put the individual and profit at the center of our systems. And so we had a leadership model that reflected that framework. The individual was all important. I can only win if you lose. Very competitive in the drive, infused with capitalism that if I succeed, people around me will succeed, but I don't really have to worry about the others. And that model seemed to work for a while, but it doesn't work in an interdependent world. And the world has become so interdependent so quickly that the kind of leadership we need today is what we call moral leadership, not from any sense of righteousness, nor a belief that there's this set of rules handed down from above. And in fact, it's quite the opposite, because it has to be so grounded in humility. But the beginning of that shared value system is a framework that goes from the individual and profit at the center to the acknowledgement that we're all connected, not only to each other as human beings, but to all living things. And so how do you build systems based on a moral framework that puts our shared humanity and the earth at the center, not the individual and profit? That's the frame. And from that, then, what are some of the qualities of leading today? Again, we use the phrase moral leadership, but what are those qualities then? Kassaga talked, moral imagination is the most important. This idea that we're part of each other, recognizing the humility to see the world as it is for all of its flaws and faults, but not being stymied by that, to also balance it with the audacity to imagine what it could be. For us, moral imagination, we say, starts with empathy, but empathy by itself reinforces the status quo. From empathy goes to immersion. The civil rights leader talks about proximity. For acumen, it's go deep, get close, understanding the systems that hold people back, and also be honest about where individuals hold themselves back. From that systems understanding within the context of the local, you can create change, moral imagination. Then connected to that would be holding values in tension. It's one thing to build a company where the value is profit and shareholder, maximizing shareholder revenues or profitability. The second, the idea of balancing that profit with a deep sense of purpose, a lot harder. So where is the leadership that is willing to hold those values and tensions? But it's not only those values: generosity, accountability, I said, humility, audacity, so that we can navigate the gray. When people hear about moral leadership, and even acumen fellows, they sometimes think that, and I would say especially today, where we have such polarization, that they see it as the path of purity. This is absolutely not that path of purity. This is, if you want to change the status quo, you have to learn to partner with those who you might consider your adversary, and those you may not like at all. How are you going to do it? What are you going to build inside yourself? Your own understanding, not only of your identity, but of other identities, and using the layers of your identity as a tool to connect. So holding values in tension. And then the work that you all do so brilliantly at Teach for All and across this community is accompaniment. That it's one thing to give people opportunity and access, But if you don't have the capability to make use of that opportunity and access, it's not that meaningful. And so as we build and lead and create new systems, what are we doing to accompany, to walk beside, to enable without solving problems for people? What are we doing with and for them so that they can then not just have access and opportunity, but the capability to make use of it? We have 12 principles, but I think I'll stop with those 3.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And I love that you touched on what we do at Teach for All. And really, I wanted to share a bit of what an excerpt from the Manifesto of a Moral Revolution, which I've been running through myself, where it says, by moral, I mean a set of principles focused on elevating our individual and collective dignity, a daily choice to serve others, not simply benefit ourselves. I mean, complementing the audacity that built the world we know with a new humility, more attuned to our interdependence. I love that the world which we live in is more interdependent. I mean, we've seen what COVID has done to us. We are so more interdependent, we depended on each other, even through the virtual calls, to be able to keep sane and be okay. And part of that, Jacqueline, for me, is what drives the work we do at Teach for Uganda and with Teach for All, of really that sense of urgency, the sense of interdependence, that our fellows who work with these rural, very hard to reach communities, what we call last mile, are able to understand that if the child at the rungs of this community does not get a great education, our nation depends on it, because these are the people who will be able to be the physicians that we need for the 21st century. If we don't, then we will be actually outdoing ourselves, because in the future we may need these. And if we don't, I wrote a piece about the fact that some of them will end up being in the rebel groups, and then the nation itself has to fight these rebels who didn't have a quality education. So that point of interdependence, not just at the global level, but also bring it to the community level, which I love with the Teach for All idea of locally rooted, but globally informed. So thank you for sharing that. I think for us, that's really what drives us. Maybe a little bit more from your experience at Acumen, Jacqueline, from your work at Acumen, what are your deepest learnings about how we develop this type of leadership? Because I'm sure it's not easy. At Teach for Uganda, we struggle with it a lot. I have gone back and forth with Wendy. So how do we build this type of leadership?
I'd love to just put you on the spot for a second. What is the biggest struggle?
Thank you so much. So the biggest struggle is, I think for us, really like what your statement says, really, developing leaders who think about the choice to serve others without that, what do I take out? Or is it just for me? Because the role models that we have in our society, for the most part, unfortunately in Uganda, are mostly politicians. And so what they see out there is, what is in it for me? You know, as opposed, what is our collective leadership to build a better society? You see the pieces we discuss at Acumen and Teach for All about how do we build a really strong interdependent societies is difficult. It's tough. It's tough conversations when you are in a world of the haves and have-nots. And the haves are already taking more. The have-nots want to get a piece of that cake. And so it's tough to get young people to believe that actually we can build a world that has shared dignity, that has shared values. It is a challenge. And to bring them from very high, like you said, elite schools like Makerere University, you know, even some from the diaspora, and say, you're gonna work in this rural last mile community. Sometimes you may not have electricity. Sometimes you may not have clean water. And the young people you're working with, these are your future doctors. This young man wants to build, we have a young man who just graduated, top of his class, Francis, I mean, he shocks me. In the last 20 years, they had never had a child graduate out of primary school. And because of our fellows, they went into this community. For the last literally 5 years, they had the first young man who left, now is at secondary school, and he hopes to build the first hospital in his community. And so it's tough to share that when someone cannot easily see it, when what they are seeing around them is take, what is in it for me? So I think for us, that has been the biggest challenge. And maybe the last one, Wendy knows this, is to find the investments that are willing to patiently invest in that kind of leadership. Yeah. Back to you, Jacqueline.
Well, it so reinforces, this is also Wendy's vision that we need more collective leadership because we're all focusing on similar values, similar skill sets. And while people talk about investing in leaders, it's not the easiest money to raise. And so I really appreciate that, Kassaga. Also, as much as we find people who want to be part of this, ensuring that we also have the humility to understand the stresses that they're going through. Because at Acumen, our fellows actually are truly, truly diverse, which is one of the great joys and beautiful parts of it. And also makes us have to be a lot smarter. Vidra can talk about this as well. But when we think about how do you actually then help form and enable that leadership, for us, it starts with the cohort, the community. And if you think about community, self, worlds, for us, the container in the community is the number one. So there's also almost an alchemy, choosing 20 leaders that are extremely diverse. And Kassaga, you'll know this, but we work in many communities where people have been raised to hate each other. So suddenly you're sitting in a group with people your parents have told you forever, don't go into that house, don't even go near that house. And now you're sitting next to the person. And we have very hot conversations using works like you talked about, Kassaga, like Martin Luther King, Letter from Birmingham Jail. But it starts at the very beginning. I remember being in Nigeria with our West African fellows, and one of our fellows was Harvard Business School and Oxford, and he was sitting next to a farmer who was an incredible leader, who really had very, very little formal education. And by the time I got there, the Oxford guy had the humility to say, Jacqueline, I have to be honest with you. On the first day of the program, I thought that I was in the wrong program. I thought this was for elites. I really wanted brand. And now I'm sitting next to a farmer. And I'm thinking like, what did I miss? And then I realized, by the end of the first week that not only could this guy be smarter than me if he had been given the opportunities and the education that I had, but frankly, I want to work with smallholder farmers, and this guy is so much smarter than me already. And now they're partnering. And so number one is the cohort. Who is in the cohort? And can you not just find elites who look like they are diverse, but actually are all cultivated in the same way, but truly people who've been raised with completely different belief systems, challenges to overcome, and create a set of shared values, recognizing that it won't be a uniform overlapping Venn diagram, but that there will be a core at the center that is articulated by Acumen's manifesto, and that they are willing to do the work to grapple with what it takes even to get themselves in there. The second piece then, which is so critical to using that cohort, is understanding self through a series of pieces. And I do want to throw it to you, Vidra. Who am I? What are my values? Many of our fellows have had, again, like yours, probably, but extraordinarily challenging life journeys that they've been taught to hide. And so right from the beginning, can you share that story in a way that is rich and truthful and move that sense of shame into a sense of power? And how do you interact with others as equals within that circle, not only in India, for instance, but then in concert with your brothers and sisters in India? You think this group is hard. Now we're going to that group together. And then the third is the world. What is happening in the world in real time that they are working on, where we could really individually and collectively make change. And that's some of the work that we're really focusing on now. But Bavidra, I'd love to throw it to you for some real specifics on some of the key 3 or 4 tools that we employ.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Jacqueline, and great to see everyone here. And I know there are a few other fellows here, Karen, Arantxa. Awesome to see this community continue to come together. Yeah, I mean, Jacqueline, you mentioned the cohort piece, which is critical, and critical to that cohort piece is the diversity in the room. And what we say is it's diversity not just for diversity's sake, but because we genuinely believe that it will require diverse points of view to move these things forward. But even in the context of knowing self, and you touch on this actually in the Stanford Social Innovation article that you just wrote a couple of weeks ago, which is great, by the way, and I recommend everyone here to read it. But as an individual, you don't really know what you stand for until you come up against someone who believes something else, until you have been challenged and understood how you respond to that moment. And we try to design cohorts around that to literally create that moment in a space that's both safe, but also brave enough for you to take a step forward towards what feels different, what feels uncomfortable. Not to try and convince the other person, not to sell them on your point of view, but just to open yourself up with curiosity. And so that diversity piece is so critical, not just for the systems piece, which is obviously important, but also for that knowing of self. And so that container that we try to create is just so critical, and it's such a core part of it. Another part of it that's really important, and Jacqueline touched on this, we use literature and we use writings and a lot of poetry as a way to enter the hardest conversations. It's really hard one-to-one to talk about the most difficult things, but people like Martin Luther King, even going back to Plato, Socrates, like there's a ton of literature that offers a springboard to have a different kind of conversation. And often you'll find when you talk to fellows in both our communities, I'd say, that these are places where you can have a fundamentally different kind of conversation that you cannot have anywhere else. It is a place where you can talk about failure. It is a place where you can express an opinion that may be wildly unpopular, but by putting yourself out there as a way of saying, I don't know if this is right, but I'm exploring it for myself. And so using that sort of third bit, not just the people in the room, but the content, a piece of literature as a springboard is a core piece of how we do what we do as well. So I'll stop there. We could go much deeper into a lot of these tools and frameworks, but Kassaga, I'll pass it back to you and happy to loop back to this after as well.
And thank you for that, Bavidra. And the only thing I would add, because it's such a critical piece that Bavidra talked about, conversations that you can only have here that aren't happening in other spaces. I would say that over the last 15 years since we started, that is so much truer today than ever in our history. That we have a community of people that includes some of the most progressive human beings on the planet. And we have people in our community that are not just born and raised, but are living in and leading in communities that are dictated by honor culture, with where the stakes are really, really high. And so the trust that they have in sharing changes that they're experiencing within the group, conversations that they've never had, not with their brothers and sisters, nor even their best friends, in part because they're so dangerous, are had here. And so that sacred trust that has to be held really becomes quite extraordinary. And it's something that's really on my mind, because of course, then the fellows have to go back to the communities, often suffer great loss in terms of even who they are becoming and how do they hold that. But it's in a world where social media, we're so ready to attack each other and not give each other time to even explore the losses that we sometimes have to experience ourselves to change, is a real problem for the world. And how do we transcend that collectively using the tools that can also be such a great gift?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thanks, Bavidra. I think for me, one lesson that I've taken away from that discomfort, that container, Bavidra, and I mean, I spent a year in India, and I could share my experience, but I will share just a bit that the first few weeks were really tough. I mean, but because I met an Acumen community that was already embedded in these tensions, and I could be able to, spend time with them and share my tensions, even just not being welcome because of just how I looked, and really being able to push my way because I knew that I was there for a right cause, was tough. But I think that's why I mentioned failure. In that opportunity to have the Acumen fellows like the wonderful young man, Prerak, that I will never forget, and the young lady who helped me put together the first website for Teach for Uganda and the first logo. Imagine through the challenges, through the tensions, I built such strong relationships with these wonderful people that became champions even after I returned home to Uganda. And every time they would see that logo on our website, they would say, we were part of that. I think that's the community that we need to be building. The other one, recently we had, at Teach for Uganda, we had a group of young campus ambassadors who lead on campus and eventually become our fellows. And this young lady shared an experience, and I was doing a training with them using the same ideals that Jacqueline will go through, Acumen, the letter from Birmingham jail, and all those readings by Martin Luther King and Mandela. So I know that they are tough to comprehend. So upon even reading them, I pulled out quotations and put them around the wall. And they had a gallery walk, kind of like reading the quotations, reflecting, and each had to pick one. And the young lady from Western Uganda had been in a leader, vice president of Guild at her university, and the tribalism that she faced. And she looked at me and she said, I wish our universities were able to teach this kind of stuff. I wish that we had a container, a room where we can discuss these tensions, because I almost dropped out of university because I felt I cannot read. First, she was a woman. Second, she was from a different tribe. And so the ostracization that she received. And so she said, Kassaga, can you please talk to our universities and start bringing this stuff to the universities? Because we never go through this kind of stuff. And when I went away thinking, Wendy's here, maybe she could share, I went away thinking, we really need to start thinking about where these young people congregate and the challenges they go through to start these discussions. This group is fantastic, but think about at the core, these are the young people. These are the ones who are going into politics. These are the ones who are going to policy, education, health. And Jacqueline, I thought about that and I'm still reflecting on it. I don't know how we can do it, but I share that back with you. But I thought that those ideals were so important. This young lady literally had eyes. She came like tears and she said, thank you for this. I pray that you work with our deans and bring this kind of training to our university.
Kassaga, you are totally, I mean, you're singing a Bavidra song, I am sure. And the two of you need to have a meeting after this, because that's why we built Acumen Academy, not just for our fellows, but with this aspiration to be a university reimagined for the world, with the new role models and the business models of change, so that people anywhere can not only access those tools, that language, those rituals, but a community to know that they're not crazy and that they're not alone. And so there could be real opportunities here to partner and to figure out other ways of doing that. And when we think about what is success, one of our many indicators is, are we getting case studies and role models into these universities that talk a big game about creating leaders for the new world, but aren't creating these kinds of spaces and are actually reinforcing too often the systems that are no longer serving. And so it'll be really exciting to see where that conversation might go.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thanks, Bavidra. And I know people have lots of questions, and I can see some of them coming. I'm gonna really humbly turn it over to Radha to help us field some of these questions, maybe to Jacqueline, Bavidra, to whoever. And thank you so much for this wonderful audience. Thanks,
Yeah,
Jacqueline.
Thank you all. I mean, such a beautiful conversation around how do we bring diverse groups of people together and create space for the real conversation. So I think so much wisdom in here. I'm going to give everyone, we often don't take a minute to just pause and just take everything in. So let's just all take a moment to pause, take in what we heard. And then I'm just going to invite anyone who's got a question to put it in the chat. So let's just all take a minute, reflect, and then put your questions in the chat. And yeah, let's see what else is there. And I know there's also some other fellows in here, so you're also welcome to share your thoughts and reflections as well. So let's all take a moment. And please do put your questions in. Yeah, I see a couple coming in. I'll give everyone about 30 more seconds and we'll just get started. Okay, John, do you want to just come off mute and give voice to your question? Such a beautiful question.
Sure, thank you. I'm John Kunrad. We met years ago, Jacqueline. And the question is, you have a global community of leaders, and what approaches have you found to be the most successful at sustaining that sense of community, particularly during these COVID times?
Thanks for that question, John, and it's good to see you again. And it is great to see other Acumen fellows from around the world here. And there are many Teach for All fellows who are also Acumen fellows, which is also a great joy for us. In a way, I hear it almost as two questions, John, because one is just overall sustenance of a community, and then the other was the pandemic. In a way, prior to the pandemic, we've always had this idea that once you're a fellow, you become a fellow for life. And so through communications, through gatherings locally, in 2017, we had a global gathering, which was the first one, unlike what Teach for All has been able to do, which I'm in awe of. And that really showed us the power of bringing people together across 33 nations. It was extraordinary. With the pandemic, however, when everything went online, you went almost to the opposite experience, where people were just in survival mode. But a few things happened. Number one, in terms of allowing us to just break rules. It was very clear from the position of New York City that the United States had a program in place to get support to companies and organizations so that they wouldn't have to let everybody go. That obviously didn't exist in most of the nations in which Acumen operated. And our fellows were operating in the most vulnerable communities in those nations. And a bit to Kassaga's point on funding, a lot of funders actually pulled out of supporting their organizations during the pandemic. And number two, even some of the people I spoke to early on felt more comfortable giving money to a food bank than to a for-profit or even nonprofit organization so they could keep people on payroll, despite the fact that from our perspective, giving people the dignity to continue to have a job and money, even if they might not be able to perform the job as they were prior, would allow them to pick and buy their own food. And so our value system got very strong. Our team changed. Literally within a week, we'd raised significant grant money, and we created local entities that then started to give grants to fellows for their organizations so that they could they could sustain. And then fellows like Arantxa, who's on the call, began to think about, well, what could they do for each other? And so Arantxa is an extraordinary fellow from Spain with blockchain capability. And she did a crowdfunding campaign in Spain, though she'd never met any fellows in India during the second wave of COVID, and raised significant money to give to the India fellows so that the India fellows could again decide where that money would go and support other organizations. In that second wave, we changed again in that, and it's a real credit to our India director, because we fancy ourselves as so disciplined in the way that we invest. And he called me and said, look, we still have some money left from our emergency fund, but this time our community is so devastated that we need money not for the organizations, we need it for the fellows themselves, to support their family members, to support themselves in some cases. And there might be shame connected to it. And so we're not going to ask questions. If they need it, we're going to just get it to them. And are you okay with that? And part of me, my first feeling was like, what's my accountability to our donors, et cetera, et cetera. But then figuring out who these donors are, said yes, as long as you have a system in place for some level of accountability. And what better level of accountability than asking a group of fellows to make the decisions. Then a donor called, who was fairly new to Acumen, and said, I want to support India right now. And I said, well, we aren't doing anything but supporting our fellows. And I don't think you should give us the money, because if you gave us the money, I wouldn't be able to tell you to whom, what they used it for, or have any accountability there. And he said, that's okay, because I trust Acumen, you trust the fellows. And so, and there will be other emergencies. And so that doubled the fund. And then the fellows themselves decided, maybe all of this generosity, that they would turn this into a pay it forward facility. And so if you can, it became then loans. If you can pay it back, you would pay it back. And they've gotten about 70% of the money that has been lent out back for further emergencies when people need it. Those kinds of stories, that kind of reinforcement that we are part of each other and that there's trust because of this community, I think is part of that sustenance. And connected to that then is, how do we communicate? How do we build and reinforce the language and the rituals so that there's a touchstone for you? And that again is some of the work that Bavitra is really doing a lot of thinking about through what we call the foundry at Acumen, that core of 1,000 Fellows.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I think that starts getting to, I mean, you're already starting to touch on what does it take to activate collectives. Maybe Larry, let's see, Larry, do you want to just share your question and I might add on something to it?
Sure, thanks for a really interesting conversation. My question, Jacqueline, had to do with this notion of collective action, the relationship between collective leadership being the kind of motive to action, but not necessarily the action. And what else stands in the way? And I'll preface that by saying that I work a lot on the issue of taking solutions to scale. And a lot of the things that we're trying to do span physical communities. And I think somewhat ironically, as the world has gotten more interconnected in some ways, it seems to me collective action is scarcer than it used to be, not more prevalent than it used to be. I think somehow the mindset that you were talking about in your early remarks has sunk in an insidious enough way, or the problems look unsolvable in a sufficiently, I don't even know how to say it, but in a paralyzing sort of a way to people that even if they're disposed to act collectively, they don't. And so I'm wondering from the perspective of your fellows, or at least as it's filtered up to you on this, what people see as the most binding constraints to collective action beyond, in addition to the lack sometimes of the will to act.
Thanks, Larry. And I so appreciate that. And I think where you went to the lack of hope is something that's very real. And it's something that all of us need to fight against. And I do think by finding role models like Kassaga and Arinaitwe and Karen and so many of you on this call, how do we do a better job lifting people who are fighting against all the odds because of that hope? Because I do think, to your point, that is one of the biggest constraints. The challenges are that you are, that we hear about, and I'll tell one, but then I want Bavindra to talk about Latin America, where leadership is actually resulting in real collective action. And Arantxa, if you want to jump in with what you're seeing. But we have a group in Bihar that that's actually started with a TF India X fellow and an Acumen fellow, realizing that Bihar is a state in India that has a terrible reputation, and that when elites do come back because they want to contribute to their states, they're so lonely because nobody understands them. People feel like they couldn't get a job elsewhere, and so they wanted to build community that also ultimately changed the narrative of Bihar. And that was about 1.5 years ago, and they now have 48 organizations that are part of this Bihar collective. Moving into action has been one of the challenges they face, although we're starting to see them go there, in part because each of these individuals' organizations is so stressed financially and so stressed just for their own survival, that then adding the collective to their plate, in their words, has become a challenge that they are determined to overcome. But I would say it is that, whether it's real or perceived, scarce resources and a real drive to deal with what is in front of you, the urgent, that makes it more complicated on the collective. Bavindra, do you want to talk about Latin America on this, the positive?
Yeah, I mean, I will just add one thing there. I mean, it is also funding. The way the system is set up. The system is not set up for collectives to raise funds against collective metrics of success. It isn't. It's still the single entrepreneur, and it's in their own free time and outside of the bandwidth of running their own organization and standing it up that they have to drive this collective initiative, right? Which is what Shravan did in Bihar. So there's something sort of structurally that is still not oriented towards that. The metrics around a collective thing don't sound as great to funders. They're not quite as appealing. They're not as clear. So that I think is a big challenge. The Bihar example is a great one. In Latin America, one thing that we are learning is that for collective efforts to work, there is a good amount of work that needs to happen of collectively, what is our singular purpose? Not the purpose of my individual organization or reorganization, but if we could move the needle on one metric, what might that be? And how do each of our individual interventions drive towards that? And our community in Colombia, I want to say almost unlike any other, has a singular focus on what it means to drive a new, more inclusive post-conflict narrative for the country. And everyone has a completely different intervention in the context of that singular purpose, but that is it. And so an extraordinary example that emerged as the country is going through this extraordinary movement of change in leadership is the now president, but at the time she was campaigning, was holding events across the country and taking questions from different citizens around the world. And the current cohort came together and said, well, we have to be in every single one of those conversations. We have to ensure that we're asking the hardest questions represented for the voices who otherwise wouldn't be in the room. And so they came together with a game plan and essentially distributed the cohort across every one of these election stops, these campaign stops around the country, came up with their sort of speech that they would stand up and deliver, and each was allocated a question to ask. And the person who asked the question was always the person who was most deeply underrepresented in that region or in that context. But it was, and by the way, this person went on to win the election. So I'm not drawing obviously a direct correlation there. But it was an extraordinary moment of, we are all very clear on what we're here to do. I'm going to actually slow down on my individual initiative in service of this collective thing, because this almost supersedes in this moment. And that's an extraordinary, choice from a leadership point of view as well. But really one really great sort of example of how we're seeing that intention shift to actual action and showing up to drive, in this case, a new political agenda.
I wonder if I could extend an invitation, kind of building on the back of that. This community of practice that I now lead on scaling, there are about 2,000 of us from 400 organizations, and we've given a lot of attention to collective action, but to my mind, not enough attention to collective leadership, into the crosswalk. Wendy and I have talked about this in another conversation. And if any of you are interested in being part of that crosswalk, I would really like to build it out more robustly. And so just an email or any other kind of contact that people would like to pursue, I would really be enthusiastic about.
Oh, fantastic. And I think this is the purpose of this community, which is to see these connections. And already I love seeing so many of the connections emerging. So thanks for that, Larry. Let me throw one more question in. It's a couple of different strands of questions that have come up that are all about, well, how do we spread and scale this type of leadership? So, there was a question from Cheryl around, we often assume a trickle down effect, but is there anything you do then to ensure that leadership spreads? And Wendy had another question about scaling reach through online programming. So maybe you can just share, Vividra, Jacqueline, just your thoughts around the spreading and scaling, and what are the different strategies and what's working, what's challenging, what have you learned?
Vividra and I are waiting for each other. Vividra, you want to start?
I'll start and then I'll pass it over to you. This is the question, right? While as a fellow myself, I love going deep with few, creating containers of 20 to have conversations that cannot be had anywhere else. And I think we all acknowledge that is wholly insufficient to meet the moment of what is required. And so we're trying to figure out how to do the deep with few and also reach the many, to drive what we're doing into a movement, frankly, right? To really democratize access to these tools and these skills. And it's really hard, as it turns out, right? And I do think you have to accept some trade-offs in the level of depth and transformation that happens in that context. But we're learning a few things. One is the types of builders, and at Acumen, we do focus on builders, right? So folks who aren't just the critics, but who have chosen to build solutions and take that first step forward. They're super busy. They don't have time. They're actually not looking to do another full program. They have a problem. They want to solve that problem in the quickest and most efficient way and then move on to the next problem. And so that's led us to really pivot how we think about spreading those tools a little bit away from long 6-week MOOC style programs to short form, 2 hours max video content, pulling in expertise and just sort of addressing that problem right off the bat. So more modular, much more efficient and more tools based, right? What is the thing I need to do now and the thing I need to do today? Another thing that we're learning is really interesting is, and I think it's connected to what Jacqueline said about this unique moment in time, is people do want to learn about leadership from people within their own context, who within their own world. It's a little bit less about, I need to learn from that, glorified Harvard professor or whatever school it might be. And I want to learn from Kassaga and what it means to build this thing in the context of Uganda. And so we're doing a lot to figure out what it means to lift the wisdom that we have in this community already and turn that into new content. And put that out as the new set of tools and skills and frameworks so that it sort of shifts on the head where leadership expertise comes from. And from our point of view, it comes from those leading at the edges and then turning that into really cool sort of short form content. And then the last thing I'll say, and Jacqueline, I'll pass this to you after, is reaching the broad and an aspiration to turn this into a movement is largely faith-based, right? It's a hard thing to measure. And so you have to believe at some level that if you put this out in the world, people will take it and run with it in whatever way makes sense to them. I saw Arinaitwe say the work that she's gone through with Acumen has affected her and her husband as well. I consider that impact. I consider that success, but that's really hard to measure. And so there is a level of just trust and faith that if you put these things out into the world, that extraordinary things will happen. And I know that's really hard to sell to a funder. We're trying, but that is one thing that I think we're learning as well. But Jacqueline, I'll pass it to you as well, because I know it's something you're dreaming about.
Well, no, I love that. Thank you, Vividra. And it's, acceleration, which was the first thing that Vividra talked about, different ways of moving people into our foundry, amplification. How do we equip the 1,000 with skills, tools that they can then use within their own communities? The teachers coming, of, by, and for. And then the thing that I've been thinking about a lot as well when it comes to these role models is truly finding those individuals that are scaling that started with the values and are infusing those values into building what I would call a new economy company, those companies that do put the poor and the earth at the center. One of those companies was started by a Teach for India fellow, Aniket. It's a company called Takdar Shak, which is a a tech-enabled platform so that very low caste and low income people who've been left out of the system can gain access to some of the 11,000 entitlement programs that exist in India today. I was just with Arinaitwe in India in a very rural village and watching not only the way that he interacted in and with community, but the listening to the agents that work there with him and how they were talking about dignity and their hunger for this kind of conversation and language and set of frameworks, that there's real opportunity both to look at a company that came out of the fellowship that could potentially reach 100 million people or more, and that then using that platform as a way of reaching others with some of the skills and tools. A second fellow I met has trained 350,000 low-income women. She's been experimenting with using these tools, including Good Society readings. She can't find any of them translated into her own language, but she could find a group of people who would do the translation possibly, or even find better readings that hold that spirit to it. And so we are also more focused on where are those and who are those fellows that we can scale. How do we build communities of practice so that people are learning from each other across the world and feeling their own community? And then to the movement work that Bavidra is talking about, how do we really understand the way people learn and connect, that may not just be courses, but these episodic interactions to inspire them to be part of this bigger movement that the world so desperately needs.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, Kassaga, do you want to give one final word? I know, let's get you one last word in here, and I'm realizing it's the top of the hour, but yeah, final thought from you, Kassaga.
I think quick one for me, it's the value of grassroots leadership, and that's, I wish Wendy would have a moment to talk about this, because we've seen that people who are closest most to the problems or to the challenges that we face really are the ones who can drive the solutions, and they are willing and quickly and eager, wanting to come together to really solve these problems together collectively. And that has been seen. We have a group here that we started post-COVID. Actually, it was within COVID when we realized that the most global organizations, NGOs left, and our communities were totally left by themselves in hunger, lack of health, education. So we created Africa Coalition for Social Impact. We have one group, and our mission is simple. How do we build grassroots partnerships to transform our own communities and really drive the change that we want to see? We have one fund, and that's where the challenge is. And these people are willing to go to deal with the tensions, to go to the last mile. Sometimes it takes more time, like Bavidra said. You will need a lot of time that you may not dedicate to your own mission, but because you know that collectively, we were able to reach thousands and thousands of communities. There are about 13 organizations in here. But we hope that as the world is changing, also funders out there could realize that the only way, like our friend Larry was sharing, to reach the impact that we need to reach the communities that we need to reach, we need this collective action. And it's becoming more clearer right here on the grassroots, because grassroots leaders realize, you know, like the Africa proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go farther, you got to go together. Yeah.
Kassaga, Kassaga, I love that. I love that as a final parting thought. And it's actually a great plug for the next People First talk that we're having in September. I encourage you all to join, because it actually builds on this theme of grassroots leadership. We're having Mauricio Miller, who's leading this, co-leading this initiative, Peer-Driven Change, which is all around how do we value the leadership that exists within communities, and how do we create peer networks to activate that? So I'm sorry to cut off this conversation, but a big thanks to you, Kassaga, Jacqueline, Bavidra, and please stay connected with one another. We'll send out the notes, and we look forward to having you in that next conversation in September, and we'll send more details on that. But big thank you to everyone for today's conversation, and hope to see you in the next one.